how the project is going to tech leads and product managers. We need to be able to write a Jira ticket that actually makes sense. And we need to be able to explain why something has gone wrong and what we're going to do to fix it to someone who's never touched a line of code. And the skills that I learned as a teacher set me up to be able to communicate well and command a room. And while the classroom management side of things helps me more when I'm leading a choir, the other skills are absolutely indispensable. So those are what I'm going to teach you in this talk. So I should clarify, like, I'm not saying that code is the same as human language. There are many similarities and many differences. You can't hold a conversation in JavaScript, and that's not an invitation to try. You can't write a program in a sentence of English, although the absolutely cursed invention that is GPT-3 may change that very soon. But human language has things like intonation, pronunciation, irony, and socio-political associations that programming languages don't. And believe me, if it was possible to write sarcastic JavaScript, I completely would, and I wouldn't do anything else. But learning a programming language does have its similarities to learning a foreign language. So, for example, both human and programming languages have a lexicon, and that's a set of words in a language. So human languages tend to have huge numbers of words that change over time, whereas the lexicon of a programming language is generally fairly set. But there are still words that you need to learn when you're learning JavaScript. And both types of languages also have a grammar. And this is a set of rules that defines how the language behaves and how the different words and phrases go together to produce meaning. And in English, we string together words in a particular way to indicate, say, like who the actor in a sentence was, or to convey something that happened in the past, or to express a hypothetical condition. And in programming languages, we string together keywords to define functions or conditional blocks and instantiate new variables. So if we take the simple sentence, I saw the cat, we can break up the syntax of the sentence into its various parts. So in English, the subject usually comes before the verb, and the object of the sentence, so the thing that's being seen in this case, comes afterwards. I'm not going to go too deep into this for obvious reasons, like I literally took several modules on this at university. But we can do the same to a JavaScript expression. So we can identify the different parts of the expression, and if we put them in the wrong order, the interpreter will throw a syntax error. And if you were speaking to someone who suddenly started speaking with words in the wrong order, your brain would probably throw a syntax error as you tried to work out what they were saying. So what can we learn from this? There are definitely some similarities between learning a human language and a programming language, getting to grips with a new syntax, and possibly even a new writing system if your native language isn't English and doesn't use the Latin alphabet. And you've got to learn all these new words and what they mean. And if you're learning another programming language, you might find yourself translating in your head to the other one you already know to help you make sense of it. So it does make sense that we can apply some of the same concepts from teaching English to learning to code and learning technical concepts in general. The two areas of software development that I'm going to focus on in this talk are mentoring others and writing documentation. So not the super technical hands-on stuff, but vital and often overlooked parts of being a well-rounded developer. They're often called soft skills, which I absolutely detest. They're really important skills. The word soft, unfortunately, does have a bit of a negative connotation. Sometimes it's dismissed as a feminine skill. But we might have to mentor others as a tech lead, or onboard a new hire, teach your kid to code, or show your mom how to edit Markdown so she doesn't keep emailing you to make copy changes on her website. True story. But we write documentation when we hand over a project, when we build a tool, a piece of software for public consumption, or we want to educate people about something. So as a disclaimer, the kind of things that I'm going to talk about are pretty general. Like there's nothing, maybe a couple of things in the talk that are super specific to language teaching, but I think you could probably say a lot of the stuff about teaching skills in general, but my background is in language teaching, hence the focus on that. So let's take a look about what we can learn from teaching when it comes to mentoring other people. And I'm using the term mentoring very generally here, so it doesn't have to be a formal arrangement. Things like Code First Girls and Code Bar are brilliant examples of that. And it could be onboarding someone new into the team, or taking a more junior developer under your wing to help them learn the skills that they need to level up. And mentoring is challenging. So you've got to get knowledge out of your brain into someone else's, and it's not always as simple as just telling them stuff. And when you think about what we do every day and everything that's involved with building websites and applications, it can be completely overwhelming for mentors to even know where to start, let alone the people that they're actually teaching. So it's really important for you to let your mentee guide you. And it's a two-way relationship. you need to know why your mentee is there in the first place. So for my English students, there were a few reasons they'd be taking lessons. Some of them wanted to become fluent. Some of them needed to take IELTS, which is an English language qualification that you need to get into universities in this country. And some just looking to improve their conversational English so they could get around on holiday. And these goals influence the kind of thing that they need to learn, as well as their approach to learning and even their enthusiasm for the course sometimes. And there were also some students who were clearly just being sent to the school by their parents and didn't really want to be there. And they were a lot harder to teach, but because they just didn't engage. But hopefully, with the exception of maybe the odd child at a coding workshop, I'm hoping you won't encounter that one. So just like my English students, mentees have goals. So if they're learning to code, why are they learning to code? Why have you been asked to mentor them? And in our world, it's not obviously as simple as fluency versus conversational JavaScript, but there could be any number of reasons, and it is important that you know what those reasons are from the beginning. And it might be obvious, you might not even need to discuss it. So for example, with a new hire, you probably know when you're onboarding someone into the team what they need to know. But in a more formal relationship, such as with a more junior developer, you should discuss their learning goals and identify the areas that they want to improve. And just as I wouldn't teach someone learning conversational English how to write an academic essay, you don't want to confuse someone who just wants to build, say, a static web page by teaching them bubble sort or how to use service workers. So knowing what those goals are in the first place will help you to narrow down those topics. And like, you don't need to write an entire lesson plan or structure some kind of massive curriculum, but it does help to make a list of the kind of thing that you think you should cover with them. And as well as knowing what the end goal of the learner is, it also helps to know how they learn the best. So what techniques are most effective when they're learning something new? And look at the different resources available to a learner and find out from them which is the most effective. So students do tend to learn better from a variety of media rather than all the same form. So if you think about when you last learnt a language, there would have been reading exercises, conversation in pairs, listening exercises, and even probably songs. I know I still remember some of the songs I learned, like GCSE German. So in the classroom setting, you can't cater for individual learning styles necessarily, but you can provide a wide variety of resources so that everyone's needs are met. And when it comes to developers, some of us read a lot of books and blog posts, whereas others prefer video tutorials or diagrams. And others will just want to get stuck in straight away, so coding and mapping things out. And some people will mix and match. So for myself, I tend to learn best by doing, so I tend to get stuck in, and I also read a lot of blog posts, but I don't think I've ever successfully read an entire programming book, and I do get bored watching videos. Sorry to anyone who's watching this as a video. So ask your learner what their preferred methods of learning are, and maybe you can point them in the direction of some materials that'll help them. So maybe they benefit from watching a video or a conference talk before tackling any code. Or maybe you want to give them some smaller JIRA tickets to work on where they can see how they get on and ask you if they need any help. And if you're leading a workshop or a group, you'll want to mix and match some of these formats. And a lot of your sessions are probably going to be hands-on coding time. You might punctuate this with mentors pairing with students or some talks, or getting students to demonstrate what they've done and explaining how they did it. And this is actually a great benefit for students because it really helps to consolidate their learning. Provide some resources for further reading on the topics that you're teaching for students to look at in their own time. Granted, many of them probably won't, but some of them might. And make sure you include some videos in that as well. And if you're recording a tutorial, provide a transcript so that people who prefer to read can get the information that you're giving in a way that suits them. Plus, it's a really nice win for accessibility as well for people who have difficulties watching video or listening to audio. So there are two sets of core skills when learning a language, so speaking and listening and reading and writing. And human languages tend to have spoken and written forms, and the skills are divided into the productive skills, so that's speaking and writing, and receptive skills, listening and reading. Now, the speaking and listening part probably doesn't apply to programming particularly well, but reading and writing definitely apply. And we think of being a developer in terms of writing code, but part of being a good developer is also being able to read code that someone else has written and understand what it's doing. So it depends how ridiculous the code is in the first place. So remember that clean code is only going to get you so far if you're writing code that's so abstract that no one can actually understand it. But the same goes for English as well. So I actually once had to reject a job application from someone who put so much effort into using language that they thought was kind of impressive, but I actually couldn't understand what they were saying. And in the English classroom, we'd work on these skills separately from learning the fundamentals of grammar and vocab, but it is all linked. And these skills help to reinforce everything that you've learned by putting it into practice. And with programming languages, you've got a lot less of this to pin down before you start writing the code. But the more code you write, the more you'll get to grips with the terminology and the constructs within the language. If you're teaching someone to speak English, you're not going to sit them right down at the start and ask them to write an essay. So you'll start them off with maybe some sentences and a paragraph, maybe a page once they're confident enough. And similarly, you wouldn't ask them to stand up in front of the class and recite a monologue until they're able to produce simple sentences. And with a programmer that's looking to build up their skills and take on more advanced work, it's the same. So as a senior developer and now a tech lead, which is terrifying, I need to make sure that more junior developers have the opportunities that they need to build on the skills they want to improve. So the first thing I do is find out what those skills are by asking them. And then I have a look through the tickets that we've got prioritized to see what would give them the right amount of stretch without completely overwhelming them. So make sure they know you're on hand to unblock them if they get stuck. And if they're taking a really long time, it may be time to intervene and help out, especially if it's affecting the team's progress. Don't let them struggle on their own. And for newcomers to programming, there's short exercises called kata, which are really helpful. And they introduce you to basic concepts one at a time, and they give you a chance to put it into practice before moving on to the next one. English students can learn a list of vocab, but it's completely meaningless if you don't actually use it in a sentence or produce a sentence yourself. So the same goes for learning to code. And an if statement doesn't mean anything until you've actually used one and seen what the outcome is. So arguably one of the best ways to actually build skills as a developer is pair programming. And this is a hands-on activity, but it's better for sharing context and getting developers used to the more idiomatic programming styles and learning the way that you do things in your team or organization. And I've worked on teams where we pair on absolutely everything as a matter of course. And I've also worked on teams where we mostly work solo and pair on things when we're stuck. And my personal preference is to just do the latter. But for bringing a new team member or junior developer up to speed, it's completely invaluable. So you might pair by taking turns to write a test and the other one makes it pass, or you might time the turns to make sure everyone gets a fair go on the keyboard. And to get the most out of pairing, there's some key things to bear in mind. And I could apply any of these rules to one-on-one conversation practice with students as well. So when your mentee's got control of the keyboard, or as we often call it, driving, encourage them to explain what they're doing. So they shouldn't necessarily narrate everything, but this will help you to understand whether they're on the right track, as well as helping them to kind of cement their own knowledge. Make sure you know what it is they actually want feedback on so that you can pay extra attention to it. And this is really important, let them make mistakes. So if you can see them typing away and you can say, oh yeah, that's going to throw an exception or something, don't correct the code before the error shows up. So let it fail. The compiler or the output will let them know that something's wrong. Let them try and debug it themselves. You're there if they need a nudge in the right direction, but try not to tell them exactly what's wrong unless they ask you. And even then, you can try and nudge them in the right direction some more by maybe asking some strategic questions rather than telling them outright. So imagine you were telling a story in a foreign language and your teacher kept interrupting you to correct you. It would put you right off your train of thought. So in companies, we've all got house styles and preferred ways of doing things, but resist the temptation to sit there and nitpick their code because it's going to be really off-putting. If what they're doing works, that's totally fine. You can go through it together afterwards and look at ways of improving and refactoring it. And finally, if you can, get them to pair with other developers on the team to give them a different point of view. They'll learn how others do it, and also you might learn something back from them as well. And when it's your turn to drive, make sure you act as natural as you can, to an extent. So when teaching English students, I couldn't chat away at my normal, ridiculously fast pace to the beginner and intermediate students because they just wouldn't understand. And the same goes for me. I mean, I speak kind of passable Spanish, but I really struggle to understand normal spoken Spanish. It just seems really fast to me. So when you've got the keyboard, take care not to zoom ahead too fast unless it's clear that the other person can keep up. But on the other hand, you shouldn't go too slowly. So we were taught in teacher training not to speak super slowly like this, because it's just not natural and it won't help the students to understand English out in the wild. So coding really slowly on purpose is going to be really frustrating for the person you're pairing with, and it can really interrupt their flow. And if you go too slowly, it's just going to seem patronizing. So ask for feedback about how they're finding it, and that will help you to pace yourself effectively. And again, when you're writing code, try to explain what you're doing. Sitting in silence as you watch a pair code is super boring. This will also help your pair understand what you're doing as well. And don't keep all the hard problems for yourself, even if it seems like you're doing a favor. If you end up with like a tricky bit of syntax or a really hard problem to solve, either work on it together or let them drive and then offer them some tips. So here's a technique for you, eliciting. It's a technique we use a lot in the classroom to get students interacting. Technically, it's a range of techniques, but it involves anything that gets the learner to provide information rather than the teacher telling them. So it wasn't just to make sure they were still listening, although that definitely helped. It's a way of activating the knowledge that the students already have, as well as helping them discover things themselves that makes them more likely to remember it. And it's helpful for the teacher to find out what the students already know and what they need more help with. So in the classroom, we might elicit sentences from students by drawing pictures on the board or asking them questions, asking for examples of things that we're talking about. For example, after we've learnt some new vocabulary or done a listening exercise. And with younger groups especially, it's often better to nominate students to answer rather than waiting for someone else to volunteer. Often just results in complete silence or the same people answering over and over. So adults tend to be generally a bit more willing to share, and you can just get people to shout out the answer, but it does depend on the group. So we can use this technique when we're mentoring developers as well. So when you're pairing, ask those strategic questions to help your pair debug a particularly tricky error or to find the syntax they can't remember without basically telling them the answer. And I found this technique worked especially well when mentoring kids. So for example, in sessions when they're building a web page, according to some instructions on a worksheet, it engaged them a lot more when they had the opportunity to think creatively about how they could personalize it. So we would point to the background or the heading and say, how could we make this a different color? You know, they could look for the color value in the CSS and we'd give them a bit of help, but they could then change it to a different one and they'd be so excited. It really personalized the experience for them. Plus they lost their minds when they realized they could put any image on the website that they found on Google, although invariably it was Minecraft. So listing works best in more formal mentoring contexts like coding workshops or pairing with a more junior developer. You can imagine in a one-to-one meeting, your mentee might start thinking you're a bit weird if you start asking them a load of questions. And I wouldn't necessarily recommend using this with a more experienced developer that you're onboarding, because it might come across a bit patronizing. But if the person you're talking to is there to learn something new and you're trying to establish what they already know, it can be a great help. And use it sparingly as well. So don't ask questions constantly. It's unnatural, it can throw off the mentee, make them just frustrated if they're trying to learn something. And if they don't know the answer, just move on, don't keep asking them. In workshop settings, for example, you could ask a question now and then to assess prior knowledge or to consolidate something you've already taught. But when you're pairing, it's a fine balance because too many questions can disrupt the concentration. So do keep it light. It's also important to choose your questions wisely. So be careful how you ask them. And it helps to ask questions that are a bit open to interpretation. So not necessarily a yes or no answer. Students tend to be more likely to answer if they feel like they're not going to be wrong. And it's obviously easier with English, where there are about 5 ways of saying the same thing, but you could arguably say the same thing about JavaScript these days. And if they do get the answer wrong, don't just say, no, that's not right. Say something like, not quite, almost, close enough. Be encouraging. And if necessary, give a refresher if people really don't know the answer. So that's mentoring. But the teaching skills I learned have also helped me massively with documentation that I've written in my career. So this has ranged from readmes to full tutorials, and I love a good long Slack post making an announcement. So sadly, documentation is often seen as a chore and often actually gets skipped entirely. But the power of good documentation really shouldn't be underestimated. It's the difference between someone getting their work done efficiently and someone having to stop all the time to find someone to answer their questions. So it can take many forms. There's readmes, docs for the software that we build. They could be in the repo alongside the code. They could be in comments. They could be hosted separately. We might write tutorials and blog posts to share knowledge with other people. And of course, there's conference and meetup talks like this one. It's not a written medium necessarily, but it is still a form of documentation, so many of the same rules apply. And I'm going to illustrate the points in this section with examples from Web 101, which is a self-guided tutorial that I put together at Monzo. So we're only a small team of web engineers, and much of our web work in internal tooling is done by backend engineers and sponsoring teams, and not all of them are super familiar with how we do web at Monzo. So we needed something to teach them the best practices and the basics of things like accessibility and testing. And I also wanted to create an onboarding document for new web engineers as well. So Web 101 was born, a collaborative effort to cover both of those bases. And it's been really well received. And I think a lot of that is down to the way that it was written. So just like with mentoring, our first step is to identify who the learner actually is. So in this case, who's going to be consuming this documentation? Are they complete beginners? Are they experienced developers looking for the query parameters for an API call? Are they, or like with Web 101, are they backend engineers who are looking to, go on a bit of a web adventure? And sometimes you're going to have a real mix. So the challenge is actually writing documentation that suits everyone's needs. And in the world of teaching, teachers assign work for the level of the majority of the class, and they've got stretch exercises for the more advanced students once they've finished their work. So we can apply this to the technical documentation that we write as well. Less experienced engineers will be able to learn at a level that suits them, while the more experienced engineers can quite happily skim over the stuff they already know. And with Web 101, we broke everything down into sections so that a developer starting from the beginning could work through sequentially, but then someone with a bit more context already could pick and choose the sections that they needed to look at. And the advantage of this was that it's also easy to link to these particular sections from various other sources. So for example, the dev environment setup one is linked all over the place from various readmes in our repos. So providing opportunities for users to skip the sections they don't need. So here in our section on the basics of GraphQL, we've got a link to skip to the actual tutorial work if they don't need that primer. Now, the importance of register. Register isn't a term that we hear very often in terms of language. So it means a variety of language that used for a particular purpose or a situation. For example, you have the language of the court, or I would use a more simplified version of English when talking to my class. Whereas when I'm giving a conference talk, I use words like whereas. And sometimes it's less conscious. For example, you might use more slang with your friends and your peers than you do with your manager without even thinking about it. And when it comes to written language, especially in a business context, we tend to talk about tone of voice. Companies often have a tone of voice document that dictates how things in the company's, in a company's brand should be written. And this is pretty much the register of your writing, so how you say what you're saying. And at Monzo, we've got a very distinctive tone of voice. It's quite friendly. It's aimed at making sure all of our customers can understand things like the terms and conditions or weird banking jargon, and there's loads of that. And our tone of voice was drafted by our brilliant head of writing, Harry Ashbridge. And this article, actually, the link in the bottom there, has some fantastic tips on keeping your writing simple and clear. So I recommend having a look at that. Now, the world of programming, obviously massive, and people might be reading your documentation from all over the world with different levels of English. And so if you write in a clear, concise, and informal manner, it means that everyone can understand what you're saying. And it's also a win from an accessibility point of view, as people with reading and comprehension difficulties are finding it much more digestible as well. Another one is to be careful not to assume prior knowledge. So when teaching English students, we had to be careful not to assume they already knew stuff, especially things tied to local culture. So slang is a really good example of that. It might seem obvious to us, but it might make zero sense to a learner who maybe learned most of their English from watching Friends or in other US comedies. And it can end up with the student feeling really disheartened. So we actually ended up teaching them slang as a formal lesson, but then in the classroom, most of the time, we'd use much more common terms when communicating in lessons. And with documentation, assuming too much prior knowledge can have the same effect. So you need to make sure that your reader has sufficient context and understanding for the documentation to actually be useful. And if you don't want to spend the time explaining the background knowledge that's required, put in a section at the beginning outlining what that required background is, add some links to find out more. and you can just rely on other people's documentation they've already written. You don't have to write anything additional for that. So in Web 101, here's an example where we're guiding the reader through adding a GraphQL query. We explain what React hooks are in a call out before we go into the detail of Apollo's use query hook as well. So the beauty of the call out is that it's kind of separate from the body text of the tutorial. So it's easy to skip over if you don't need it. I would also recommend getting a less experienced developer than you to read through the documentation to identify anything they don't have context on, and then you can expand on those things where you need to. A great game that we used to play with our English students was Articulate. So you're given a word and you have to explain what it means to your team without using the actual word. And it's a fantastic way for students to practice their vocabulary, but also explaining things. Description skills are such a useful skill in foreign languages when you can't remember the word you want to say. So memories of needing to buy a packet of tissues in a pharmacy in Spain, and all I could manage was small paper for my nose, but it worked. I got my tissues. So it's something we have to do as teachers too, because if a student asks what a word is, we can't use that word to explain it. So we have to explain its word meaning in words that the student can understand. And being able to describe technical concepts in simple terms is such a useful skill. I really can't state that enough. So a clear explanation can be the difference between someone sitting and banging their head against the desk and feeling stupid, and that light bulb moment where suddenly everything becomes clear. And some concepts are easy to explain than others, but a good explanation can totally transform your documentation. So the world's worst party game suggestion coming up now is to practice your skills explaining technical concepts by putting together a list of words and having a game of programming Articulate with your colleagues. Yeah, it might sound really silly, but it is really good practice for being better communicators. And the non-technical people in your team will be so glad for it when you can explain exactly what you're working on in non-technical terms. So in Web 101, we could assume a base level of programming knowledge. We knew engineers were going to be reading the document, but we didn't know whether they were going to be back-end or front-end. And things like GraphQL wouldn't be familiar to everyone, so we had to explain them. And the tutorial centers around donuts and writing a front-end view to manage donut purchases. So using this to illustrate what the schema looks like, we explain what queries and mutations are and what the various constructs in the schema do. And we've bolded the significant words, and we've used simple explanations, not too wordy as well. Another great way to explain technical concepts simply is to use real-world analogies. And we use these in English teaching a lot to kind of demonstrate English words that our students didn't understand. So for example, you might describe embarrassed or embarrassment by describing a series of really embarrassing events as if they happened to you. So a few years back, I worked on a team where I was implementing an OAuth style authentication flow with refresh tokens, and our product manager wanted to know what I was actually working on, and she's not technical at all. And so I ended up illustrating it using this ridiculous analogy involving a secret clubhouse where you have to say a password to get in, and then there's a secret handshake, which is your access token that you need to actually speak to anyone in the clubhouse. And then every 5 minutes the handshake changes, and you're given a special badge, which is your refresh token, that you need to show when you want to learn the new handshake. And when you leave the clubhouse, they take that badge off you and you get a new one the next time you come in. It was absurd, but it got the message across. So you can spice up your game of programming Articulate by coming up with ridiculous analogies for technical concepts. The weirder the better, and see if they actually work on your non-technical friends and family members as well. Can you get your mum to understand Kubernetes, or your dad? So I spoke before about the importance of knowing your learner, so understanding your goals and intentions. And what you teach them should be relevant for their goals. So readmes and tutorials are a little bit easier for this, as you know who's going to be reading them and what they want. But for a blog post, you can kind of imagine who your target audience might be and just write for them. But presenting just facts to the reader is only going to get you so far. I would teach my students like everything from letter writing to describing injuries. And we even had a lesson on the F word once, which with all the ways that it can be used in English, surprising number of ways. And the thing is, if students don't know why they're learning this stuff, it's not going to be nearly as effective. So you learn to write letters so you can write a cover letter for a job or sort out visa things. You might need to make a doctor's appointment in a foreign country or have a medical emergency. And when you're living in a foreign country, you're going to hear people swearing, and you should probably know what they're saying. So with documentation, explaining why will help the reader understand what exactly they're doing, and it'll also help to cement that knowledge in their brain. So why do we need these environment variables, or why is it bad to give an on-click attribute to a div? So giving that additional context will make things a lot clearer to the reader, and it'll also make it seem less like kind of arcane magic. And so in Web 101, we made sure to explain things like why we have to run the build script when browsers already understand JavaScript, or why we should be using semantic HTML. And it gives that extra little bit of clarity, and especially with the semantic HTML, it makes the reader a lot more likely to actually do it. And finally, imagine learning a new language, so whether that's human or programming language, and trying to get your head around a difficult concept. So look at these sentences. These are examples of modal verbs. And imagine trying to get your head around this as a non-native speaker. It's a nightmare. It's a nightmare to teach. It's a nightmare to learn. English is basically just a nightmare. And some people find grammar a lot easier than others. So I always found it a lot easier than vocabulary. I can never remember the words for stuff. And so when I was learning modal verbs, when I learned German at school, I found them comparatively straightforward, but a lot of my classmates thought they were really confusing. And in one Spanish class I took, I was struggling with understanding something that the lecturer was talking about, and I said it was difficult, and he was just like, no, it's easy. And I felt like crap, and I didn't learn anything, and it was horrible. So imagine looking through the documents for a library that you're using and being presented with this sentence. Simply synthesize the circuit, then just get to the VGA sensor through the online HDD address. It makes no sense because it literally is nonsense. But for someone reading a technical document about something they're not familiar with, what you've written might seem like this as well. So what seems simple to you won't necessarily be simple to everyone. And for that reason, we have banned the words simply or just or simple, anything like that from Web 101. And that's something I think is one of the most important things to writing good, accessible documentation, because all those words do is make people feel bad about their own abilities if it doesn't seem simple to them. And ultimately, we got some fantastic feedback on Web 101, largely down to that consistent, clear writing style, the approachable nature of it all, the background information, and the thorough explanations. So my colleague said, I just wrote a brand new bit of code following the guidance there, and it just worked. I find this happens very rarely in engineering, and it's testament to the quality of the docs. So I've given you a lot of things to think about in this talk. If you want to put them to the test, there's some places you could go, some things you could try. So if you want to try out mentoring, there's always Brighton Code Bar, big fan of Code Bar. Code First Girls run teach like coding courses for women and girls, and they're often looking for mentors who work in development. You could find a junior developer in your company and offer to mentor them. Offer to onboard a new starter. If you want to get started writing some documentation, you could contribute to some open source projects on GitHub. You could write some getting started docs for your company. Start a blog. Blogs are cool again, you know. Or you could go to dev.to, which is a really nice place to start technical writing and just practice your writing skills. So thank you very much. That's my Twitter, that's my email. If you want to get in touch, I believe I have some time for questions. Yeah, thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for that, Sophie. That was absolutely brilliant. I have more than one question, let's say, but I'm not going to hog the time. Who else has a question for Sophie? Yes, go Steve.
Thank you, Sophie. I really enjoyed particularly the part you were saying about using the language very carefully in your documentation, so you avoid using certain words which will, as you said, make people feel bad about themselves if they don't understand them straight away and so on. Something we do really badly in my company is documentation. I'm sure we're not unique in this. Have you got a style guide that you've written, or a set of rules that you said, do say this word, don't say that word, or something, or, you know, have you got some sort of formalized set of rules, or is it all just kind of an implied thing?
So when we were actually developing the guide, we had kind of there were a team of us. Like I was kind of coordinating, and I wrote some of the sections, but kind of we had other people in the web discipline also doing those sections, and I wrote some guidelines for them while they were developing, while they were writing it, and kind of just tidied them away once we were ready to kind of launch it out into the wild. But actually, that's a really good idea, having a style guide for internal documentation. So internally at Monzo, we have a training guide called Writing Slightly Betterly, and that's about basically how to communicate well and write clearly, because tone of voice is so important to everything that we do. We're kind of all trained in it when we start, and so I guess we take those principles and then just roll with it. I think we don't really focus on technical writing in that. So yeah, that's something we could totally start implementing and would work really well, is having that style guide for technical writing.
You do have some sort of training which you've all done at the beginning, which probably feeds into that. That's really cool.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on people actually doing the training, but yeah.
Right.
Anyone else have a question? Go, Jake.
Hey, I have several questions. The first is, how do you convince your management to allow you to write docs?
Wow, that's like a proper internal screening moment. So I think one of the biggest arguments for writing docs is that it means that I don't have to go and help people, and I can go and get on with my work, right? So if I've written this really clear document about how to do thing X, then people are going to stop coming to me and asking me how to do thing X, because it is written on the document, and I can just give them that and tell them to go away in a nice way. So basically, I guess it's about freeing up your developers' time to actually, deliver the good stuff by investing a little time at the beginning. I mean, documentation should always be living, like it's never finished. It always evolves as systems evolve and as like workplaces evolve. But yeah, if you've put that time aside to write the docs, and then you've said, there's the docs, go and look there, then yeah, you end up with a lot being like disturbed a lot less, and your work will go a lot faster. So I'd say something like that, I guess.
Can I follow up on that point about documentation always being living? Because we in my company have invested a chunk of time in the past to write documentation, only for the code base to move on and the documentation becomes redundant, and then motivation just sort of starts to get lost, especially if you're aware that a part of the code base is a bit old and crufty and may get replaced at some point. How do you make the decision of when to invest the time to write the docs?
So I mean, already about once or twice since I wrote that Web 101, our code base has changed in a significant enough way that we've had to rewrite sections of it. And often it's just a case of like, oh, I should probably, like when someone will, so we use Notion, which is like a kind of online documentation thing app. It's, it's all right. But one good thing about that is that like a lot of people can contribute to it. So people will leave a comment saying, oh, this doesn't seem to work anymore. Can you confirm? And then one of us will be like, oh yeah, that's changed now. We encourage readers to actually update it as they do the tutorial. But for other documentation, systems docs are, I mean, I've never seen it done in a way that hasn't gone out of date at any company I've ever worked at. I think it's an argument for like documentation as close to the code as possible. I don't think that having docs about systems in say Google Docs or Notion or anything like that is necessarily that useful, because it's easy to forget they're there for one thing, and if it's next to the code, you're much more likely to update it when you're changing that code. So for things I've seen work well in the past is for example, for API documentation, having a Swagger spec, which is like a YAML spec for APIs, and it automatically generates like a whole UI which you can explore with all the API information, using things like Storybook for component libraries as well, which is showing you how to use those components as well as what they look like. So kind of documentation and code together. But I mean, in a short answer, it requires a bit of discipline, and that feedback loop is really important. So you need to know when it's gone out of date, and you can only know if someone reads it and goes, hang on, it's not like this anymore.
Yeah, okay. So would you say that you need to sort of commit to to not just writing the documentation, but like as an organization to keeping it up to date as well.
Yeah, it's a bit like having a baby or having a puppy or something. Like, it's cute and great and amazing, but you do have to look after it. It is a responsibility. I think, you know, it's worth having. I think it's worth like putting that, if you have like a set of engineering principles at your organization, have that written into engineering principles. Have it like give people feedback when they're written feedback when they're yes when you're so if they update documentation, then just, you know, give their manager some feedback saying this is amazing, this person is wonderful, promote them, whatever. So encourage, I guess, make it part of your culture, which is totally easier said than done. Like, we have so many ancient documents at work that have never been touched for years, so I don't know if anyone's got that right yet, to be perfectly honest.
Sure, but like, look, just a quick glance over the Web 101, it seems to be that you've, even if no one's got it right, it seems that you've got it more right than others have. so I'm keen to learn. Cool. Who else? Sorry?
No.
Yeah. Who else has got a question? Jake again.
That kind of builds on what you were just saying. So you said, like, your documentation should be alive, it should be staying up to date. But what if you have, for example, if you're working for an agency and you have a lot of projects on the go and some of them have more legacy code, but they still work in a specific way? How do you document both the way that you should be doing things now and how you should do things on old project A?
I mean, yeah, it's a tricky one. I think with legacy code, so I've worked on projects that have like real legacy code bases at other companies, and I mean, you could pull out the old argument of all code is legacy code at some point, but I mean, there is code that just isn't going to change anytime soon. Especially if you're kind of replacing it with something new and decommissioning the old stuff, then I suppose it's less important that stuff is live, unless you are making changes to it as you migrate over or something like that. Well, I don't think that live documentation is only for kind of new, shiny, exciting applications. I think all that live documentation really means is that people occasionally change stuff in it, and keep it up to date. Like, it's a big term for what is ultimately just a little bit of maintenance, really.
Thank you.
Does anyone have a question about the other side, the sort of the one-to-ones and the pairing? Because I sure do. But does anyone else have a question on that? No, okay, great. I'm going to go for it. So how have things changed for you during the pandemic with this? Because obviously it's quite different not being able to sit there. I only sort of recently actually used the VS Code live share feature, and it is really good for that. Do you use something like that, or yeah, I can see you.
Yeah, big fan. Yeah, love a bit of live share. That blew my mind the first time I used it. So in the olden days, we'd use Screen Hero, which then got bought by Slack, and Slack killed it. But there's a couple of others that have come up since then. But yeah, I usually just go to VS Code Live Share now, because it means that like most of us use VS Code, and then like both parties can edit stuff on the screen. And actually, in some ways, it's a little bit easier than pairing in person, because you don't have to kind of keep passing stuff over, and you have a video call going in the background to talk about what you're doing. So yeah, I honestly, remote pairing works really well. And I used to even do it in the office sometimes, when I was pairing with a colleague who's working from home. I honestly don't think that working from home needs to affect pairing or any kind of collaborative work like that in any way. We're lucky to have really good tools at our disposal.
We are, yeah, I completely agree. It was weird, the whole Slack like killing screen hero thing, wasn't
Yeah,
it?
I
I was
don't know
like,
what
oh,
happened
look
there.
at this, yeah, very weird. I don't have a question on it, but I just wanted to thank you for all of your advice regarding regarding pairing as well. There was a lot of things that I've sort of learned the hard way, and a lot of other things that I just hadn't really considered. So thank you for that. I also wanted to ask you. You made a really good point about sort of learner goals and what they want to get out of it. With I feel like when it comes to TEFL, there's almost always going to be some motivation that they're going to want to learn English. Whereas I've encountered a few times someone coming to learn programming and they're just simply curious, you know, they just simply heard about programming, curious about what it's about and things like that. Do you think it's better to sort of leave them just to foster that curiosity and see where it takes them, or do you try and encourage them to come up with a goal in mind of like, okay, so why would you want to do this? What area of your life would it affect?
I mean, it's a tricky one because again, it depends on the person, and I think if someone who's just kind of a bit curious about programming, it might help for them if you can narrow it down a bit. So I guess, you know, when I started, I learned, like as a kid, or a teenager, I started building websites, but I never learned to kind of program in like what anyone would consider a programming language till I was like 24. But and I had no idea where to start. Like I didn't really know what programming really constituted before then. And so for someone who is kind of vaguely interested in programming, there's so much to it. There's like, you know, I know people who are learning things like SQL and Python because they've developed an interest in data science, which to me, I don't really understand why anyone would develop an interest in data science, but I know a lot of incredible data scientists. And then there's people who, you know, do hardcore back-end programming, and then there's like, and like we have ridiculous number of microservices at Monzo, and there's people who do all sorts of stuff with Kafka, NSQ, all of that stuff, and then, you know, there's the web folk who build these lovely, gorgeous, accessible interfaces, and then it's such a massive, massive world, and I honestly think people will need a nudge in a direction, and they might not know what those directions are. But I guess what you could do is just sit down with them and say, right, like these are the kind of, you know, things that you can do in this world of programming, and if you want to try out, say, statistical modeling, then you could try R, or if you want to play with some APIs, you could try Ruby or JavaScript, Node, and for, you know, for some people it's enough to just, you know, get a Pokedex showing on an HTML page, and for some people they want to be able to generate a lovely looking graph. So again, it's about talking to that person and finding out what their interests are, and then pointing them in the direction of something that's going to engage those interests as well as teaching them something.
Yeah, that's really good advice. That's a good point. But by the way, if you're wondering about the people that are bing bonging in at this point, is because I need to make a very public apology here. When we were doing in-person asyncs, we would start the talk at 7:45, and I fear that some people are sort of joining in, so they're thinking, oh, this is when this is starting, and I confess I didn't signpost it properly, the change in time, so I'm very sorry to people that are just joining. But the good news is that I recorded the talk, and so you can watch it back. And Sophie is still here, so if you have any questions, please shout out. Well, actually, I'm going to pause now for questions briefly. Who else has got one?
Yeah, I've got one. I've had my camera off. You can hear me okay, yeah?
Yeah.
You'll notice a bit of a static glitch in the matrix here. But yeah, quite a cool word to learn today, eliciting. I've been the receiver of that technique a lot, and I kind of found a way to use it. But how I always find eliciting is quite obvious when you're doing it kind of to a student. It's like, oh, how would you go about this? And you sort of get that kind of cheese. It feels a bit cheesy.
I totally get that.
What are good ways to make it less cheesy, basically?
Yeah, I mean, that's part of it's why you should be careful who you use it with. Like if you're kind of you're showing your, you know, new tech lead the ropes, or new head of engineering the ropes, and you start using it on them, and they'll be like, what are you doing? That's why it works, especially it works super well with kids because they're used to that. I think yeah, pick your moment. So the example that I gave in the talk was when if like there's an error, if you're pairing with a more junior developer and there's an error and they're trying to work out what's wrong with it, and you can kind of nudge them in the right direction by asking them questions, and they'll know what you're doing. Like it's obvious. It is an obvious technique. Like there's nothing subtle about it, but it does. It's telling them where to go without telling them where to go, I guess. And the advantage of that is that it'll help them come to the conclusion themselves, and they'll feel good because they'll solve the problem themselves. You didn't actually tell them the answer, you just kind of pointed them in the direction by asking them strategic questions. But yeah, I mean, that's where I kind of laid into the whole don't use it sparingly, and yeah, be careful who you're using it with.
Cool, thanks.
Good advice.
I am well aware I'm completely shiny. My window doesn't open, unfortunately, so I'm absolutely boiling.
Yes, Steve, go for it.
I've got a question, not about the talk, but about Monzo.
Oh,
Something I read a blog recently that said it was in the context of a lot of people saying, you know, microservices are dead and they're last year's fad and so on. And it was something about Monzo has it was either 1,600 or 16,000.
Oh Christ, not
something like that,
yeah.
some ridiculous, crazy number, and they all work, and everything works, which is just a miracle for me to hear that. Is that true, or is
So I don't know the exact number. It's probably around 1,800.
Right.
So they all work most of the time. We have downtime. We have a very, very, very good platform team, infrastructure team, who are absolutely incredible. I've never worked with anyone quite like them, and they are just so on it with like just making sure everything runs smoothly. We've got a great on-call team. We can react really fast. So yes, there's a bit of overhead with having that many microservices, and I mean there are definitely cases where a monolith is much more sensible, but when you're running something like a bank, it really helps to be able to move really fast and scale up certain services really quickly. So if something's getting hammered with traffic, we can just scale that up, and then the rest of our systems are quite happy just motoring away in the background. Because everything's in the cloud, we can do that really fast.
from a dev's perspective, presumably you don't have 1,600, 1,800 services running on your MacBook just to be able to change a button on a website, do you? You have a small subset of them, and
yeah. So from the web perspective, like I do a fair bit of backend work as well, but like from a web perspective, we run our local web apps against our staging environment, so they connect to like the cloud basically in AWS. Right. We can run the systems locally. So there are a set of core services, and we have something called Magneto, which is a tool that runs locally that will kind of orchestrate all of those services in their various containers. And then so we've got the core services running, and then you'll spin up the service that you need to run your thing. And often that'll have a couple of other services that you need to spin up that have dependencies. So you do end up with a rather nice kind of graph of dependencies. But I've got to say, usually it's quicker just to deploy it to the test environment and try it out there,
right,
rather than fiddling around with microservices on your laptop. Because yeah, Docker really hammers the MacBook. So
sure.
Yeah, during the heat wave, there were plenty of my colleagues that were just like, I can no longer have this on my lap.
Yeah.
Fantastic. So I have another question, but does anyone else have one? No, okay, I'm going to take. So I feel like this might be quite a failing for me, but often when I am programming and pairing with someone, we will come to a challenge, and I will just not really know how to solve it myself, and they will try something and it won't work, or they'll start going in a different direction, and I'm trying to both sort of guide them in the right direction, but also trying to figure out how to solve the challenge myself. And I sort of I don't go to silence or violence. I go to silence or complete confusion, and I don't think it's very helpful. So, do you have any advice on like what to do when you become a bit unstuck yourself as the supposed mentor in this relationship?
Yeah. So, as someone who frequently doesn't know what they're doing, I would recommend admitting that you don't know, and then going on a quest together to find out the answer. So, yes, it's a really good question. I think one of the pieces of feedback that I got from my interview at Monzo, which I totally thought I bombed, was that when I didn't know the answer, I was good at articulating my train of thought. So I think that's really important. So yeah, be honest that you don't know the answer, but then part of the learning there is how you go and find out the answer. Because we all Google like 9,000 things every day. Like there's no such thing as knowing all the answers as a developer. So that's a great example for the person you're mentoring to see how a developer solves a problem that they don't know the answer to. So actually, rather than thinking it's a failing, actually is a great opportunity to teach them something else. So it could be where to find the best information, who's the person in your company that you ask about questions like this, or like, what's the best way of searching on Slack to find this particular error message? So it's actually think of it not as a failing, but as a really good opportunity.
That's a really great advice. And we might need to embark on a mentor-mentee relationship together for you to teach me how to search in Slack, because I haven't got a clue. But yes, that's great advice. One other quick question: where did you get your T-shirt from?
Oh, the internet. It's oh god, it's a few years old. Yeah, Ada and Jean and Grace and Margaret. Yeah, I think it was one of those Teespring or one of those ones. I'll see if I can dig it out and let you know.
I'll give it a Google. I saw Ashley commented on it in the chat as well.
Oh, cool.
Brilliant. Who else has got a question?
Also, I'm totally open to questions by email or Twitter if you'd rather as well. Just anytime.
Brilliant. Go on, Jake.
I have a statement, which is
more of a comment
back
than a
real
question.
quick to the live share thing. You mentioned that you've live shared in the past with colleagues when they're working from home or something, but so I work from home like once a week, and so I got in the habit of using live share, and I've started preferring to use live share even when I'm in the office with people, just because there's, I don't know, you're both in your environment that you're used to. You've got your editor set up however you like with your key bindings and your theme, whatever. It's just a little bit easier, and you can quite quickly try and solve those problems that even you might be having, and then I'll sort of like leave comments as I'm going as to why those lines have changed, which works quite well. Yeah,
that's very interesting. I never thought about that. I do, like, there is that irrational kind of panic when you're using someone else's laptop, and especially if they have like the opposite theme that you prefer using, and you're just like, what is wrong with you? Yeah, I get that. I think I worked for a long time with a colleague who used Vim exclusively. I'm not afraid to say that I hate Vim, and it was a nightmare. So yeah, something like that. I can imagine why you'd want to do that. I think, yeah, that's a really good idea. Otherwise, otherwise you've just got to make sure that if you're pairing a lot, just make sure you're all using the same key bindings.
I've got some people that are used to using Windows machines, and so they've rebound their control and command so they do the opposite, and oh god, that's hell.
Yes, this is my keyboard, and I confess that I use Vim key binding, so I'm really sorry in advance.
I'm never gonna pair.
Yeah. I keep a separate keyboard, and I change the key bindings in VS Code when needed. I promise. I'm nice. I wanted to ask you a question, Sophie. With the documentation examples that you showed, there were a couple of times where you explained, for example, what React hooks were or how GraphQL works. How do you make the decision on when to sort of explain things in your own words versus directing people to the necessary documentation on the internet?
So I guess it's a matter of like how important is it that the person knows what this is, and how easily can I explain it that's not going to take me an entire article. There are some things I feel like need a bit more in-depth reading. So for example, we use Cassandra in the back end, which I have opinions about, but you know, it's a complicated like distributed database, and you're not going to explain it in a paragraph. I couldn't explain it in a paragraph. I probably don't understand it well enough to explain it in a paragraph. So I point someone towards maybe an article on it. There's a paper on it, and there's also like numerous articles about it. Whereas React hooks, you can kind of, you're assuming that the person reading it has a base level knowledge of React, or at least can pick it up as they go along. And then you can kind of explain it in a sentence or a paragraph. You might as well just explain it rather than having to kind of take them out of what they're doing. I would, like, at the end of every section of Web 101, we had lots of links to further resources. So if they want to learn any more about it, sometimes we'd link to more articles at the end of every like call out, or but like if you want to learn more about this, see this article, or but yeah, just provide the supplementary reading. But the goal should be really to allow the reader to read through it without having to go all over the place to find out what they need to know. So yeah, if you're going to link to other resources, then like as a prerequisite, then just explain that it is a prerequisite. You should read it before, rather than reading it in the middle of what you're doing.
Gotcha, great advice. So if there's a prerequisite, make sure that it's clearly stated. Otherwise, explain only what you need to explain to accomplish the goal for what, you know, the broader concepts you're trying to get across. Okay, cool.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's totally fine to add a bit of supplementary information, like interesting facts, and just, you know, it can make it a bit more fun to read if you add a bit more explanations, or you add a few of those kind of like explanations of like why you do this. Yeah, it just makes it a little bit more approachable. But yeah, if it is a prerequisite, it should be at the beginning, because you've got to do it first.
Totally agree. Other questions? I think, oh, is that you putting your finger up? Sorry, go on, Jake.
One more, which is another probably hard question to answer, like how do you get your managers to allow you to write docs? How do you get your juniors to read the docs? Because often I send people links to documentation and then I get the same question again the next day.
If you find out, please let me know. Yeah, I mean, so all of our onboarding, all of our new starters go through the same onboarding process. And so I made sure that we got our Web 101 guide in that as kind of a recommended but optional piece of documentation. Because if you're never going to touch the web at Monzo, you don't need to read this. But it's still a challenge to get people to know that it's there. So, I mean, I talk about it a lot, and I tend to very unsubtly nudge people towards it when they ask me questions like, oh, yes, this thing is in this section of Web 101. So, I mean, you just got to make sure that they can't avoid it. Like, it's everywhere they look. And just every road that they turn down, it's there at the end waiting for them as the ultimate answer to all of their questions. But yeah, I think getting people to actually do stuff is very difficult. That's my biggest takeaway from all of this, I think.
Interesting. Any other questions before we wrap up? No? Okay, I shall do a quick wrap up then. Sophie, I wanted to call out a few things in the chat. So a bunch of people have said, like in various different parts, how much they've enjoyed things. I thought there was a really interesting message from Elise saying that she really loved your presentation and tagged along as a non-deaf person because the topic's really interesting. So it was really fascinating for her. So I thought that was really cool. Me and Ashley were sort of noting with when you were saying about the analogy, like how is also a really great way of solidifying your own learning. Like it's to be able to explain things via analogy. You kind of have to think, oh, actually that's not quite right because of X, Y, and Z. And it's I think that's true of everything that you've said. So the pairing, the mentoring, the documentation, all of it it doesn't just help the other person. It's a non-zero sum thing. It really helps level you up as a developer as well. And I guess I would be right in saying that we shouldn't be disheartened if, to begin with, this stuff is just really hard. Like, it's like a muscle that if you practice it, if you practice this communication and this ability to explain difficult concepts, then you will get better at it over time, and your writing will improve as well over time. Someone at our work wrote a long series of blog posts about how to be an engineering manager, and they ended up getting a book deal from Pragmatic as well. And they, like, you know, he was a great writer, but like, it was something that you could see evolve over time, and how well he was able to do that. So you know about him. Yeah, so I think there's a lot of hidden benefits that you might not necessarily see. So yeah, it was such an important talk. Thanks so much, Sophie.